forum, where in one day we're circling the world with an outlook for the year ahead on energy. And of course, you cannot have that conversation without the participation of the International Energy Agency. And we're delighted to have Tim Gould, Chief Economist of the International Energy Agency, leading off our conversation today. And with that, a sense of where does supply and demand balance as we start out 2023. I think in some ways that was the greatest question of 2022, and everybody stumbled their way through that once the Ukraine war started. And perhaps we'll kick off at that point, Tim. The outlook for supply demand balance last year, it seemed everybody kind of wobbled around getting that right. What does it look like at the beginning of 23? Is it a bit easier to look in the IEA crystal ball and give us a sense, a more accurate sense of where you think that demand balance, supply demand balance will go?
Well, thanks very much, Sean, for the chance to join you, and it's a great pleasure to share some thoughts from the IEA on these important questions. Naturally, the level of uncertainty remains extremely high, but I think we can start to see some interesting contours of the way that the world might come out of today's deep and complex energy crisis. There are, of course, some massive wildcards still out there. The shape of the global economy, what happens with China's reopening, particularly also now the way that global trade flows and investment flows react to events and to policy uncertainty and prices and so on. But I think what's clear to us, at least, is that as we think of ways out of today's crisis, there's one route that feels unlikely, and it feels unlikely that we'll get back to the way things were before in terms of Russia's relationship or position in the international energy world. It feels unlikely that we will ever get back to the state of play prior to the invasion of Ukraine. And so that rupture that did so much to royal markets in 2022, that feels like a permanent fixture now. And so when you look at the ways out of the crisis, then, so, you know, there's only a few that the sort of economics would allow for. I mean, either you're going to double down on investment in oil and gas and new supply coming through, or you're going to find alternative ways to meet that demand through investment in electrification or potentially in coal in some economies. And then, you know, there's also the potential that we would improve energy efficiency and bring down demand that way, or we will have sort of demand destruction of the sort that we saw in some countries in 2022. And what's interesting from our perspective is that, you know, we don't yet see that a surge in investment in traditional oil and gas supply. There's only a few parts of the oil and gas industry that are investing more now than they did in 2019, and that's really a few national oil companies in the Middle East. So it seems
it's in a way kind of that sort of lack of capex, which has been bedded in now for a number of years, is delivering an energy crisis over the horizon a little bit. Perhaps it's already arrived with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But I wanted just to get your sense. I mean, the IEA described 2022 as the first ever global energy crisis, and I want to just, because I think language matters a little bit. I think last year we were all coming out of COVID vulnerable to the unknown, but also the hyperbole, the idea of sort of perhaps over egging the pudding a little bit, and then consequently, you know, where do we go with the idea that one doesn't want to you know, sell the scale of the challenge too big. Like, for example, Germany had its record employment year last year, the highest level of employment since the reunification. I mean, there was no energy crisis in Germany. So my point is, ultimately, the IEA forecast of 3 million barrels of Russian oil derailed the first ever global energy crisis. I mean, did you guys just get it wrong? And what is your correction position for 2023?
So I think the position that we didn't have an energy crisis in 2022 is pretty difficult to sustain. When you look
The
at what
first
happened,
ever global energy crisis, though. I mean, that was your language, right? Not that there wasn't an energy crisis and still is, but the first ever global is a big framing.
so if you look at all sorts of indicators about the impacts on the broader economy, or price levels, or just the degree of disruption that occurred when Russia cut its gas deliveries to Europe by some 80%. I mean, that had very wide-ranging impacts, not only in Europe, but around the world, as Europe increased its LNG imports last year by some 50 BCM. You saw repercussions of that in many markets around the world, notably in South Asia, for countries that were facing extreme difficulties then with electricity security and other aspects of energy security. So I think you had many destabilizing factors as a result of the events in 2022. First and foremost, of course, Russia's invasion of Ukraine. I think it's also fair to say that when we talk about the first global energy crisis, that doesn't deny that there have been periods of extreme volatility in markets before. But I think we should remember that the oil shocks of the 1970s were largely concentrated on single fuels. Of course, they had broader repercussions. But in 2022, we're talking about a country, Russia, which has been by far the largest exporter of fossil fuels worldwide, around 50% higher than the next largest fossil fuel exporter, which is Saudi Arabia. And so the implications of the crisis last year, and because of Russia's standing in the energy world, they had a breadth and they had a complexity which we'd not seen before. And that's why we were calling this the world's first global energy crisis. And in other ways as well, I think, when you look back at the 1970s, you can see that the oil shocks were causing undoubted pain for many consumers around the world, for households, businesses, for entire economies. But they also led to a period of quite profound innovation, deployment of alternative technologies in many areas, improvements in efficiency. If you look at the data for new car sales in the US in the 1970s, at the beginning of the decade, the average fuel efficiency of a new car sold in the US was around 18 liters per 100 kilometers. By the end of the decade, it was closer to 10 liters.
So are we seeing the seeds, the green shoots of any of those kinds of transformations coming in 2023 and beyond?
Well, I think we are, and I think that's there's some important parallels there with the 1970s. But I think there are some other very important indicators that suggest that the implications of today's crisis could be even more far-reaching. Because today we have a suite of clean energy technologies that are mature, that are ready for the big time, and we can see that investment in some of those technologies is picking up very rapidly. We released at the end of last year some new forecasts for renewables and suggested that over the next 5 years, the amount of installed renewable capacity worldwide will be the same as we've managed to install over the last 20 years. And so there is that acceleration, and so that's being reinforced by not just climate priorities, but very strongly by energy security priorities, and also by considerations of industrial policy. Because countries around the world are really seeking a foothold in that new global energy economy, and you can see that in the Inflation Reduction Act in the US. You can see it in all sorts of initiatives taking place in Europe, and you can see it also in Japan, but naturally enough in China and many other countries.
Do you think we've got to the point, Tim? I mean, amongst the many surprises and sort of counterintuitive outcomes in 2022 was the how little Russian oil exports were disrupted. Obviously, the gas pipeline issue, very specific to the sanctions and so forth in Europe. But ultimately, the global fungible nature of oil meant that Russian oil continues to flow with little disruption. I'm wondering for the outlook for 2023. Have we now come to the point where we sort of say, well, we've looked at all of the possible disruption from the Russian war in Ukraine, and little to no oil out of Russia will be disrupted? Or what's your sense for the year ahead as to the scale of that challenge is still with us?
Well, I think you're very right to point to the differences between oil and gas markets in that sense. I mean, there aren't sanctions in place on Russian gas deliveries to Europe. That has really been, sort of unilateral cuts from the Russian side. But when we look at oil markets, it's undoubtedly true that the Russian production and exports have been more resilient than we initially expected. But of course, there are big changes afoot, and everyone's aware of the ban now on imported seaborne crude from Russia, which entered into force in December. And we're watching very closely how tankers and shippers, traders and shippers are reacting to that. And there are some signs of some quite important falls in Russian exports as a result. And everyone is also aware that at the beginning of February, a similar ban will come into to enforce on imports of oil products to Russia. And there, I think we need to be very watchful, because the reconfiguration of global trade implicit in that oil product ban is going to be significantly more complex than what we've seen already on the crude side.
On the crude side, though, can you speak anyway specific to what the IEA's outlook for numbers are? I mean, you have revised upwards your demand growth in 2023 for oil products, with the outlook moving up to 1.7 million barrels per day growth in oil demand in 2023. What is your outlook for where Russian oil exports, disruption-wise, or others, for the year ahead?
So in our latest oil market report, we state that our position for Russian output in 2023 is likely to see a reduction of about 1.4 million barrels a day year on year. So that's where we are. There are some quite notable increases anticipated from the US, some from Norway, from elsewhere. And so, the balances look okay for the year, but of course there are many wildcards, and one of the key ones there is of course China. There's a lot of different views out there on how this reopening will play out, but I think we all have to have in mind that it seems that in 2022, demand in China for oil and for gas fell. And anyone who spends any time looking at energy markets will know what an unusual sort of coincidence of events that is.
Well, certainly in China, it was even more surprising in that it is the second year in a row that China oil imports declined, although still holding at a fairly formidable 10 million barrels a day. So it's not clearly an off a cliff situation, but it's not 12 or 13. And where that sort of goes, I suppose, into the new year, one would have to anticipate, I would think, that China follows like the rest of the world. Big uncomfortable opening with COVID spreading, but eventually boom times return, and oil demand soars into the second half of the year. Is that how you see it, or what's your thoughts?
Yeah, broadly speaking, I think the second half of the year is clearly the one to watch when we look for big changes on the demand side or the import side from China. You mentioned the figure of 1.7 million barrels a day of anticipated oil demand increase for 2023. Around half of that comes from China. And likewise on the oil on the gas side, we did some work at the end of last year, just underlining for any European readers who may be thinking that Europe is out of the woods, it wouldn't take much for gas markets to tighten again very considerably in 2023. So we sort of did a stress test of the European gas balance, looking to see what would happen if Russian deliveries by pipeline fell to zero this year, and also if Chinese LNG import demand went back to 2021 levels. Now, you could argue about both of those, but they're not inconceivable. Under those circumstances, we would see some significant strains again on the European gas balance. Of course, there's big uncertainties over temperature, but what we wanted to underline is it's much better if there's a potential gap there, that it's filled by sensible policy measures that can bring down demand or accelerate some of the changes underway that would affect gas demand, rather than putting the strain on European energy or gas intensive.
Well, you wouldn't want to be betting the other way, right? I mean, the likelihood China returns to some version of normal LNG imports at some point in the next 12 months, the likelihood is gas goes to near to close to zero on pipeline in from Russia. I mean, you don't see any real change in the Russian war. So if you are European policymakers, you'd be foolish, and they have been foolish before about their energy policy. One mightn't say they won't do it again. But Tim, I just wanted to pick up on your views around, as you mentioned, the February 5th sanctions on Russian diesel, Russian products, which is it draws a big spotlight on the already changing dynamics on global energy flows. As we say, Russian marine-bound fuel no longer going into Europe, now going into Asia. Middle East products already finding a home into Europe. US obviously sending a lot of fossil oil and gas in all new directions. I just wanted to get your sense of where the IEA views these new flows. As you started out your commentary saying a lot of things are permanent in their changes. I'm wondering where you put views on the changes in energy flows, oil and gas flows, and what that means for the markets.
Well, I think it's highly likely that more Russian deliveries will look to find a home in Asia. We don't see that all of the supply that's displaced from Europe will find a home in other markets. And that's the reason why we have that reduction in Russian output for 2023, and indeed for the years that follow. And that has then increased competition between Russia and some other sort of traditional exporters to Asia for market share in those extremely important Asian markets. But I think when it comes to products, it is a more complex situation, because as we are all aware, China, India, both are oil product exporters. So you're not going to have the same, in a sense, safety valves for oil products as you do for crude. So we're going to need to have a very complex reconfiguration of flows also in the Atlantic basin, with Europe taking more from some Middle Eastern suppliers, from North America, and then potentially Russian oil product exports finding homes in parts of Latin America or in Africa. Now, none of that is simple. There are quality specification issues. There are all sorts of tanker and storage issues that would make that very complicated. So we need to be very, very watchful of how that plays out in February and beyond.
Does the IEA put much concern wading into the G7 price cap that has been introduced at the end of last year on Russian crude? Is that going to be a factor in 2023?
I think it's undoubtedly going to be a factor in 2023, and we're watching very closely to see the extent to which traders and shippers are incorporating that into their decisions already for crude in December, and we'll be saying some more about that in our oil market report, which comes out in the middle of January. But yes, I mean, that is a very important factor in the market, and the design there is to keep to allow for a continuation of these flows, but to ensure that there is a cap on the revenue available to Russia. Naturally, there's a lot of politics involved in here, and there's a lot of different interests. So there is a large degree of uncertainty about how this plays out. But I think it's certainly going to be a big factor in markets in 2023.
Just to finally, you mentioned obviously the reference to the 1970s and the legacy impact of the Middle East oil embargo on the West in that period and the crisis that occurred and the outcomes, one of which was the creation of your organization, the International Energy Agency, and the responsibility of each member to maintain a 90-day storage on its crude oil and energy requirements. I'm wondering, we've seen in the last year a significant depletion of strategic inventories, particularly in the US. What's your outlook for the rebuilding of inventories in 2023, and what sort of draw that may have on demand?
Well, I think the decisions on rebuilding those stocks will obviously be sensitive to the overall context for oil markets. So we'll have to see how that plays out over the course of the year. But I think it's important to recognize that from an IEA perspective, we retain that important sort of safety net for oil markets. We're very focused at the moment also on measures that governments can take to ease tensions in gas markets. And when it comes to energy security, let's not forget that some of the big emerging issues are also in the electricity sector and in some of the other elements that are extremely important for energy transitions. And that's your battery metals, that's some of the other critical minerals that are vital for many of the clean energy technologies, which are seeing an investment boom right now. So while we continue to keep a very watchful eye on oil markets, we're devoting a lot of attention also to some of these new and emerging energy security issues that are only going to grow in importance for the coming years.
I mean, storage and capacity across all energy. I mean, the biggest problem in Europe probably today is the lack of natural gas storage. It's certainly a massive problem in Asia, where it's practically non-existent. But just back to the oil storage issue, I mean, is there a sense, I mean, the US looks incredibly low. I mean, putting aside every other sort of critical factor in the world, when you have oil supplies, strategic storage at these levels, regardless of other issues, and you practically no idle capacity around the world, or very little, oil prices are staying high for the foreseeable future.
Well, I think you need to keep the releases of strategic stocks in 2022 in perspective. There are still substantial stocks available to IEA member countries that could be deployed in case of necessity, and you can imagine that we will continue to keep a very close eye on market developments and potential disruptions this year. So there is that in the sense that part of the arsenal is still very much intact. That said, it will, some countries will be looking to replenish those stocks as and when it is prudent to do so. So I think that option for the IEA and for its partners will remain very much on the table.
Do you have an outlook for where the oil price goes in 23? Do you any reason to see it moves out of where it is at the moment, 80 to 100?
So Sean, you know us well enough that we don't have an outlook for the oil price. But I think it's fair to say, and this is what we said in our oil market report in December, that as we move through the winter months and towards potentially there are factors that could tighten the market in 2023, and we've mentioned many of them. And so we certainly wouldn't rule out either another price rally or continued upward pressure on markets.
And yet we have this announcement on the first day of the year from the director of the IMF warning that a third of the world will go into recession in the coming months.
Yeah, and that's really those competing dynamics have been, that's been the center of the discussion on oil markets and indeed many other commodity markets. Worries about the global economy on the one hand, but then the potential for supply uncertainties, disruptions on the supply side as well, and that's, I think, going to remain the sort of the balance of the discussion between those two. Between these two elements is going to remain at the center of our our outlooks and our analysis this year as well.
Yeah, it's going to be somewhat, again, as we started our conversation, reading the tea leaves, we could be going into recession as described by the IMF for a third of the world economy and more, and yet be near full employment, as we're seeing in Germany and the US, where these two things can coexist. And what is the outcome or the impact on energy demand when these two things coexist, these counterintuitive times that we are in? We'll have to leave the conversation there. Absolute pleasure to have Tim Gould, Chief Economist at the International Energy Agency, kick off our conversation this morning. Thank you so much, Tim.
Great. Thanks a lot, Sean.